What would you do if you discovered your partner's betrayal in the most unexpected way? A simple smartwatch, a single message, and Jason's world is turned upside down. With lies, secrets, and a love shattered beyond repair, can he find the strength to move on? Or will revenge consume him? Watch as emotions collide in this gripping story of trust, heartbreak, and betrayal. Are you ready to uncover the truth? Jason Miller sat back in his chair looking out over the skyline of Denver. His life had always felt perfectly balanced. A steady job as a software engineer, a lovely wife, Laura, who worked as a marketing manager, and their well-maintained home that spoke to their success. Life was supposed to be good, wasn't it? But lately, something had been gnawing at him. It wasn't an obvious issue, but something subtle, a shift he couldn't quite explain. It had been happening for a while now. He noticed it first when they stopped laughing over simple dinners, when conversations started feeling more like obligations than expressions of love. Laura, who once shared every little detail of her day with him, had begun to retreat into herself, keeping her thoughts and emotions sealed behind a wall he couldn't breach. Jason dismissed it at first. After all, work had been stressful lately. Laura had been spending late hours at the office, often returning home exhausted and distant. Maybe it was just that, stress. But then he began noticing small, almost imperceptible changes. She would slip away for a quick phone call in the middle of the night, her voice hushed, the words too soft for him to hear. It wasn't suspicious at first, but it didn't sit right with him. It had been the third time he saw her gaze shifting uncomfortably when he asked about those late-night calls that made his heart start to race. His gut was telling him something was wrong, but he refused to believe it. He trusted Laura. They had built this life together. He had always believed in the strength of their marriage. Jason had always prided himself on being a man who saw the world through clear eyes, not letting insecurities cloud his judgment. But this was different. He tried to push the nagging feeling aside, focusing instead on the dinner plans they had made for the weekend. But as he sat there that evening, his mind kept wandering back to those moments. Her unexplained absences, her distracted demeanor, the lingering hesitations when he asked her about her day. It wasn't until that night, just a few days ago, that Jason stumbled upon something that would shatter his reality forever. Laura had left her smartwatch on the kitchen counter as she stepped into the other room to take a call. Jason hadn't meant to snoop. It was a fleeting moment of curiosity. But as he glanced at the screen, his stomach dropped. The message from an unknown number was clear and shocking. "Can't wait to see you tonight." His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he couldn't move. He didn't know how to process what he had just read. Who is Ryan? He thought, his mind racing. The message was innocuous enough, but the context was enough to make Jason feel like his world was about to come crashing down. His first instinct was disbelief. He told himself it could be a mistake, a harmless conversation. But deep down, he knew better. His gut told him this was no accident. His wife, the woman he had trusted, had been hiding something from him. The thought twisted like a knife in his chest. Jason picked up the smartwatch, his hands trembling as he opened the message, scrolling down through more exchanges. There were more texts, flirtatious, intimate words, shared moments that shouldn't have been his to see. His heart sank lower with every word. In that instant, everything about his marriage, his relationship with Laura, felt like a lie. All those years of trust, of love, seemed to crumble away in the blink of an eye. He stared at the watch, unable to comprehend what he was seeing, trying to put the pieces together, trying to make sense of it all. But the more he looked, the clearer it became. The woman he had trusted with his entire life was betraying him. Why? He whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible. Why had she done this? What did Ryan offer that he hadn't? The pain was unbearable, but it wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that his wife had been living a double life, hiding her affair right under his nose. Jason didn't know what to do. The only thing he could feel was an overwhelming sense of shock. His world had been turned upside down. The woman he thought he knew so well had been hiding a secret, and now everything was about to change. Jason couldn't stop replaying the message in his mind. "Can't wait to see you tonight." The words, the intimacy behind them, cut through him like a blade. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the smartwatch, feeling the weight of the betrayal settle in his chest. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the watch back on the counter. Everything he knew about his marriage, about Lara, was now a lie. But there was no time to dwell. He needed answers. The disbelief was still heavy in his gut, but anger was starting to build, sharp and unbearable. He needed to confront her, now. It wasn't like he had been ignoring the subtle signs. It was the small things, the gradual distancing. For weeks, Jason had felt something shift in their marriage. Lara had become more absent, emotionally and physically. She started staying late at work, something that had never been an issue before. Her phone was always within arm's reach, but always turned face down when she set it down. Every time he asked her about her day, there was a vague answer, a deflection, a change in her tone. Jason, however, had pushed those feelings aside. Work stress, he thought. She was just tired, but now everything was clear. He had been naive, trusting, but now that trust felt like a broken promise. When Lara came home later that night, her smile was forced, and her eyes didn't meet his. She tossed her purse on the counter, muttering something about a long day at the office. Jason's heartbeat quickened as he approached her. He couldn't wait any longer. "Lara, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight. He barely recognized it, cold, controlled. His pulse was racing, but he needed to stay calm. She paused, her back still turned as if she knew exactly where this conversation was headed. "Jason, I don't have time for another one of your rants about my hours at work," she began, but he cut her off. "No, this isn't about your hours at work," Jason said, his voice now steady but laced with pain. "This is about you, Ryan, and everything that's been happening behind my back." Lara froze, the color draining from her face. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was shaking now, a weak mask for the panic she was trying to hide. "I'm talking about the messages," Jason said, his throat tight. "The messages you've been sending to Ryan, the late-night calls, the lies. Don't deny it, Lara. I saw it. I heard it." Her face went pale, her lips trembling as she took a small step back. For the first time in their relationship, Jason saw genuine fear in her eyes. He'd never seen her so vulnerable, and yet there was no sympathy left in him. She had shattered his trust. She had shattered them. I didn't mean for it to happen, Jason," Lara stammered, her voice breaking. "It wasn't like that. It just happened." Jason's breath quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. "It just happened," he repeated, his voice rising. "How could you do this? How could you destroy everything we had? For him?" She looked away, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't want this, Jason. I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. I was lonely. I needed someone to talk to." Jason felt a surge of anger and betrayal. "Lonely? You've had me, Lara. I've been here. But you decided to choose him." His voice cracked with raw emotion. "How many times, Lara? How long have you been lying to me?" Lara's shoulders slumped, and she sank onto the couch, covering her face with her hands. "I'm so sorry, Jason. I never meant to hurt you. I love you. I do, but I was confused. Ryan, he understood me in ways you don't. I didn't want to lose you." Jason stood frozen, staring at the woman he thought he knew, the woman he'd shared his life with. She was sitting there, confessing her betrayal as if it were just another mistake, a mistake that had destroyed him. He couldn't bear to look at her anymore. His heart had shattered and no apology could fix it. "I don't know who you are anymore, Lara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His anger was turning to hurt now, a deep, gnawing pain. "You've destroyed everything. How do we go back from this?" Lara looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know," she choked out. "But I'll do anything, Jason. Please, don't leave me." Jason stood there for a long time, staring at her, torn between his love for her and the unthinkable betrayal. The silence between them stretched on, thick with unspoken words. Finally, he spoke. "I can't fix this, Lara," Jason said, his voice low. "I don't think I want to." He turned and walked out, leaving her behind. As he stepped into the cold night air, his body numb, Jason realized that he was no longer the man he was a few hours ago. He had been shattered, broken by the one person he trusted the most. The tension between Jason and Lara was unbearable. The silence in the room felt suffocating, as if the air itself was thick with betrayal and regret. Jason stood by the door, his mind racing, his heart pounding. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. He had spent years trusting her, loving her, and yet here they were in a place he never imagined they'd be. Lara, still sitting on the couch, wiped away a tear, her hands trembling. "Jason, please, Stop," Jason interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. He had to take control of this conversation, even if his hands were shaking with anger. "I don't want your excuses, Lara. I want the truth." Lara looked at him with wide eyes, her lips quivering. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "It just happened. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Jason's jaw clenched as he stepped further into the room, unable to tear his eyes away from her. Her words were like poison, each one digging deeper into the wound that was already festering inside him. He had always believed in their love, their marriage, but now that belief was shattered. How could she do this to him? "You didn't mean for it to happen?" Jason's voice was low, cold. "How could you say that? You've been lying to me for months, hiding something so big, and you think that's an accident?" "No, Lara. This was no accident. This was a choice. And you chose him." Lara flinched, the weight of his words sinking in. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled slightly and she collapsed back onto the couch. "I never wanted to hurt you. I swear, Jason, it was just... everything felt so out of control. You were so busy with work and I felt alone. Ryan was just there for me. He listened. I didn't know what to do, but I love you. I swear I do. This is a mistake, Jason." Jason's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to yell, but he held it in. What could he say to make her understand the gravity of what she had done? She hadn't just broken his trust. She had shattered his entire world. "You love me?" Jason repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "If you loved me, Lara, you wouldn't have done this. If you loved me, you wouldn't have kept lying to me. All those nights, all those times you said everything was fine, were they lies too? What else have you been hiding?" Tears started to stream down Lara's face, her breath catching in her throat. "I'm sorry, Jason. I never wanted to hurt you like this. I thought I could handle it, that I could keep it from you. But I couldn't. It just got worse and I didn't know how to stop it." Jason took a deep breath, his chest tight, as the full weight of her words sank in. How many times had they stood side by side, believing they were partners in this life? And now everything felt like a lie. "Did you ever think about me, Lara?" he asked, his voice trembling with raw emotion. "Did you ever think about what this would do to us? You think you can just say sorry and everything will go back to normal? No, it doesn't work that way. You've ruined everything." Lara sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "I never wanted this to happen," she repeated, almost as if she was trying to convince herself. "I love you, Jason. I do. Please believe me." Jason's heart twisted, but he couldn't allow himself to feel sympathy, not yet. Not when the betrayal was still so fresh, so deep. He needed space to breathe, to process. "I can't do this right now," Jason said, his voice hoarse. He turned away, his legs moving on their own as he walked to the door. "I can't look at you right now. Not until I figure out what to do with all of this." Lara reached out, her voice a desperate plea. "Please, Jason, don't leave. We can fix this. We can talk through this." Jason's hand froze on the doorknob as he turned to face her one last time. Her face, streaked with tears, was a picture of regret and guilt, but Jason's mind was made up. "I need space, Lara. I need time to figure out who I am now, who we are. You've taken that from me." Without another word, he opened the door and walked out, leaving her behind. The sound of the door closing behind him felt like the final nail in the coffin of everything they had once been. Jason sat in the hotel room, the silence deafening around him. The weight of his decision to leave their home, to walk away from Lara, felt suffocating. He had done it. He had made the choice, but the pain gnawed at him, relentless and deep. He had to get away. He needed to be alone, to process the betrayal, the heartbreak. But as much as he tried to distract himself, his mind kept drifting back to her face, her tears, her hollow apologies. He thought about the life they had built together, the vacations, the quiet dinners, the plans for the future. All of it felt like a lie now. How could she do this to him? How could she tear apart everything they had shared? The love, the trust, the years of companionship, gone in the blink of an eye. Jason's phone buzzed on the table, dragging him from his thoughts. He stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. It was a message from Laura. His stomach tightened as he unlocked the phone. The message was brief, a plea that was becoming all too familiar. "I'm sorry, Jason. Please, I need you. I know I've hurt you, but please don't shut me out. We can fix this. We can make it right." Jason stared at the words, the pleading tone cutting through him. He wanted to respond, to tell her how badly she had broken him, to let her know that he didn't know if he could ever forgive her. But he couldn't bring himself to write it. His hands shook, and his heart ached, but he knew that replying would be a mistake. He tossed the phone aside and buried his face in his hands, feeling the tears welling up. He hadn't cried since he found out, hadn't allowed himself to break down. But now, alone in the cold, sterile hotel room, the dam broke. It was like a flood he couldn't stop. His chest heaved as the sobs shook him to the core. How could she? How could she betray him, the man who loved her so completely? Jason had always believed in loyalty, in the vows they made to each other. And now? Now he was left with nothing but an overwhelming emptiness. The hours dragged by, and Jason lost track of time. He had gone through the motions, ordering food, scrolling aimlessly through his phone, trying to distract himself from the relentless thoughts swirling in his mind. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the reality of what had happened. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Sarah. He almost didn't pick up, but something in him stirred. Maybe she could help, or maybe he was just desperate for some human connection. "Jason?" Sarah's voice came through, shaky, concerned. "Are you okay? Laura called me. She's a wreck, Jason. She's been crying for hours. I don't know what to do." Jason squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his fingers to his temples. "I can't, Sarah. I can't." His voice cracked, the weight of the moment breaking through again. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect her to lie to me like this." "I know," Sarah said softly, "but Jason, don't you think you need to talk to her? Maybe she deserves that chance. She's sorry. She's really sorry." Jason shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. "Sorry isn't enough, Sarah. It never is. She chose him over me, over everything we had. I don't know if I can ever look at her the same way again." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jason could hear Sarah's breath, unsure of what to say. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter now. "I just want you to be okay, Jason. You've been through so much. Please, don't let this destroy you." Jason didn't know how to respond. He wanted to scream at her, to tell her that nothing would ever be the same. But the truth was too painful to speak. So instead, he just sighed. "I need time, Sarah. I need to figure out who I am now, what's left of me." His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm broken." He ended the call, leaving the silence to creep back in. The tears had stopped, but the ache remained, a constant reminder of how deeply he had been betrayed. He couldn't run from it anymore. He was left with nothing but the truth, that the woman he loved had chosen someone else, and in doing so had shattered him in a way he couldn't easily repair. Jason couldn't escape the nagging questions in his mind. He sat in the dimly lit hotel room, the air thick with confusion and betrayal. After the confrontation with Laura, there was no resolution, no peace. His heart ached as he replayed every word she had said. "I love you," she'd claimed. "I didn't mean for it to happen." But none of it made sense. She had said those things, but then she had gone behind his back. As the days passed, Jason grew restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than Laura was willing to admit. She hadn't been honest with him, not fully. And Jason wasn't the type of man to let things go until he had the truth. One night, as the city of Denver hummed outside his window, he made the decision. He would find out everything. No more half-truths, no more lies. If Lara wasn't going to come clean, he would dig deeper, even if it meant breaking into the very life he had built with her. Jason knew his way around technology. It was his job, after all. So, with a sense of cold determination, he started. He opened his laptop and began his search. Lara's social media accounts, her emails, and her phone records. He needed to understand the extent of the betrayal. Every message, every detail felt like a piece of the puzzle. But as he dug deeper, the truth began to unfold in ways he hadn't expected. The first thing he uncovered was an email exchange between Lara and Ryan. At first, it seemed innocuous, just a few work-related messages. But as he dug further, he found a thread that revealed more than he had anticipated. Flirtation hidden beneath the professional exterior, subtle insinuations, and coded language. The deeper Jason looked, the more sickened he felt. One email caught his eye in particular. "I'll see you at the hotel tonight, just like last time. Can't wait to hold you in my arms again." His stomach twisted. Each word felt like a stab to the chest. The affair had been going on far longer than he'd imagined. He had thought it was just a fleeting mistake, but this was a full-blown betrayal. Jason leaned back in his chair, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. His mind raced, his thoughts jumbled. How could she do this? How could she be so cold? The image of Lara, the woman he had loved, having intimate moments with another man, destroyed him. He had always believed she was the one person who would never hurt him. But now, everything he thought he knew about their relationship was in question. He continued scrolling through the messages, each new one more damning than the last. Lara had been lying, not just about the affair, but about everything. There were trips they had taken together, paid for by Ryan. There were weekend getaways and late-night rendezvous, things she had hidden from him, all while pretending everything was fine at home. Jason felt numb, his mind struggling to make sense of it all. The anger had begun to bubble up, but it was mixed with something else. Betrayal, sorrow, and a crushing sense of hopelessness. He thought about calling Lara, confronting her again, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't bear to hear her excuses again, her pleas for forgiveness. The damage had already been done, but something inside him needed closure. He needed to understand why. Why had she done this? Was it just about sex? Was there something more to it? Or was he just a convenience, someone she could rely on while seeking validation from another man? He needed answers. It wasn't until Jason started reviewing their bank statements that the full scope of Lara's deceit became clear. There were payments to a hotel in the city, receipts for dinners with Ryan, and charges that didn't add up. The affair wasn't just emotional. It was financial, too. Jason had been providing for her while she spent money on him, creating a life of luxury on his dime. The rage began to build in Jason again. He slammed his fist onto the table, causing the laptop to shake. He had been used, and worse, he had been blind to it. He had trusted her, believed in their future together. And all along, she had been hiding this secret life. As the night wore on, Jason found himself sinking deeper into the pit of disbelief and anger. He could feel his grip on reality slipping, the betrayal eating away at him. He had to confront Lara. He had to make her face what she had done, but a part of him hesitated. He wasn't sure he could handle what she would say. Was there anything she could say that would make it better? Could he ever look at her the same way again? For the first time since discovering the truth, Jason let himself feel the weight of it all. The sadness, the confusion, the anger, they were all part of the same truth. His marriage was over. The love they once shared had been torn apart by lies. With a deep breath, Jason closed the laptop, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't let her get away with this. She would face the consequences of her actions, whether she was ready or not. Jason couldn't remember the last time he'd slept. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more confusing and painful than the last. He had spent the past few days in a fog, barely managing to eat or function. All he could think about was Lara and the betrayal that had completely unraveled everything. His heart, once so full of love for her, now felt hollow and heavy. The more he thought about it, the harder it was to accept. He had seen the messages, the emails, the receipts. There was no denying it now. Lara had been living a lie, and he had been too blind to see it. The anger burned inside him like an uncontrollable fire, and yet there was a numbness too. A quiet, suffocating numbness that made everything feel distant and unreal. For the past few days, Jason had avoided Lara's calls, her desperate messages. She had tried to reach him repeatedly, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. What could he say? What words could fix the damage she had done? His mind was made up, but his emotions were still a mess, a jumble of betrayal, confusion, and hurt. Tonight, however, he had made up his mind. He would face her. He would confront her once and for all, and this time there would be no turning back. No more excuses, no more lies. He needed to hear the truth from her, but even as he prepared himself for what was coming, part of him wanted to run, to hide from the inevitable confrontation. He knew he had to face it, but the thought of seeing her again made his stomach churn. Lara had left several voice messages on his phone. The first few had been full of pleading apologies, the kind of desperate words that only made Jason feel even more betrayed. "I'm sorry, Jason. I didn't mean it. I love you, I do. Please don't leave me." The last message, however, was different. It wasn't filled with excuses. It was softer, quieter, almost resigned. "I understand if you don't want to talk to me, but I need to see you. I need you to hear me out. Please, Jason, please, just give me one chance." Jason had listened to it once, maybe twice, but that was all. He couldn't listen to her anymore. Not after what she had done. Not after everything he had uncovered. He had always thought that if something like this ever happened, if his worst fears were realized, he would confront her with anger. But instead, all he felt was a hollow emptiness, like he was watching a story unfold but couldn't find a way to be part of it. He finally stood up, wiped his face with his hands, and took a deep breath. "This is it," he muttered to himself. "This ends now." The plan was simple. He would go back to the house, face her, and force her to admit everything. He needed closure. He needed to hear the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Lara had stolen his trust, his peace, and now she would have to face the consequences. Jason reached the front door, standing outside for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The thought of seeing Lara again brought a sharp pain to his chest. He hadn't seen her in days, but it felt like a lifetime. His hand lingered on the doorknob, his mind racing. Was he doing the right thing? Was he ready to hear her side of the story, knowing it could make him feel even worse? Or was this the final step in cutting her out of his life forever? He took another deep breath and opened the door. Inside, everything was still the same pictures on the walls, the same furniture they had carefully picked out together, the same sense of home that once brought him comfort. But now, it all felt foreign. The life he thought they shared was gone. Lara was sitting on the couch, her back to him, her head bowed low as though she had been waiting for him. "Jason," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I knew you'd come. I didn't know how to reach you." He didn't answer at first, just stood there, the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, but he knew what needed to be said. "I found everything," Jason finally said, his voice low and steady. "I know about you and Ryan. I know about the lies, the secrets, the nights you spent with him. I know everything." Lara didn't look up, but he could hear her breathing faster. She was trembling. "Jason, please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you. I love you. I was confused. It was a mistake. Please, you have to understand." Jason closed his eyes, the weight of her words making his chest tighten. "You don't get to say that anymore, Lara. You don't get to call it a mistake. This isn't just a mistake. You lied to me. You betrayed me in the worst way possible. And now, I don't know who you are anymore." The words stung, but they felt right. He had to say them, even if it hurt. The woman sitting before him, the one he thought he knew, was gone. And in her place, there was just a stranger, someone who had destroyed everything. Jason's eyes burned, but he refused to cry. He couldn't allow himself to feel weak. Not here, not now. He stood in front of Lara, watching her as she trembled on the couch. She had asked for a chance to explain, but now, Jason was unsure if he even wanted to hear her reasons anymore. The truth, the complete, undeniable truth, had already been laid bare in front of him. She had betrayed him, betrayed them. Lara had never looked so small. Her tears fell freely now, but they weren't the tears that made Jason want to comfort her. No, these were tears of regret, of guilt, of someone realizing they had lost everything and that no apology would ever be enough. He could see it in her face, guilt, but also desperation. She was clinging to the last thread of hope that Jason might somehow forgive her, but Jason had nothing left to give. He took a step forward, his voice hard and unyielding. "I don't know what you expect me to do, Lara. You think an apology can fix this?" She wiped her eyes, her voice trembling as she looked up at him. I know I've hurt you. I never meant for it to go this far, Jason. Please, just listen. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I love you, and I've always loved you. This affair, it was a mistake. Ryan was a mistake." Jason's breath caught in his chest, and a dark laugh escaped him, bitter and hollow. "A mistake? A mistake?" He shook his head, his mind a blur of confusion and pain. "No, Lara. This wasn't a mistake. You made a choice. Over and over again you chose him. You chose to lie. You chose to betray me, our marriage, everything we had." The words hit harder than he anticipated. He hadn't expected the anger to come pouring out so fiercely, but it did. His voice cracked with emotion, but he pushed forward. "You say you love me? If you loved me, none of this would have happened. You wouldn't have kept sneaking around behind my back hiding things from me. You wouldn't have lied again and again to my face." Lara gasped, looking up at him as though he had struck her. "Jason, please. I never meant to hurt you like this. I swear I was confused. Ryan, he made me feel wanted, Jason, and I was lonely. But that was nothing compared to what we had. Please believe me." Jason held up a hand, stopping her words before they could reach him. He couldn't hear it anymore. The justifications, the explanations, the lies wrapped in layers of regret. He didn't want to hear any of it. "You lied to me, Lara, for months, and now you expect me to believe you? You think I'm just going to forget everything because you're sorry?" She choked back another sob, but Jason couldn't bring himself to comfort her. His hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. He wanted to feel sorry for her, but the only thing he could feel was the crushing weight of his own betrayal. He was angry, furious, betrayed beyond anything he could have imagined. He didn't know who she was anymore. The woman he married, the one he had given his heart to, was gone. She had chosen someone else, and nothing could ever change that. Lara's voice was softer now, pleading. "Jason, please. You don't understand. I made a mistake. But I never wanted to lose you. I never meant to break us apart. Please, just talk to me. Let's work through this." Jason's jaw tightened, the raw pain cutting deeper. "You don't get to fix this. You don't get to decide how this ends. I do." Lara's face crumbled as her sobs grew louder, but Jason remained unmoved. He was no longer angry. He was exhausted. His emotions had run dry, drained by the weight of her lies. He had been her rock, her partner, her husband. But now all that remained was this emptiness. "Jason, I'm so sorry," Lara whimpered, standing up now, stepping towards him, but he took a step back. "Please don't leave me like this. Don't just walk away from me." Jason looked at her, his heart breaking all over again, but he couldn't allow himself to give in. He had to stay strong, even if it meant hurting her more. He couldn't let her manipulate him into forgiving her. He couldn't let himself forget the hurt she had caused. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you, Lara," he whispered, the words heavy in the air. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." Lara collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands as the weight of his words hit her. Jason stood there for a moment longer, watching the woman who had once been his everything crumble in front of him. He turned and walked toward the door, his legs heavy, his heart a lead weight in his chest. As he opened the door to leave, Lara's voice stopped him. "Please, Jason, don't leave me like this," she cried out, her voice breaking. But Jason didn't turn back. He couldn't. He stepped out, closing the door behind him with finality. He had given everything to her, and now he had nothing left to give. Jason couldn't escape the crushing weight of it all. The days that followed his confrontation with Lara were filled with emptiness. He tried to keep himself busy, working long hours, spending time with friends, but none of it could drown out the relentless ache in his chest. He kept replaying the same scene over and over in his mind, Laura breaking down, pleading for his forgiveness, but the image was always accompanied by the gnawing realization that she had already betrayed him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the betrayal in her eyes, heard the desperation in her voice. She had tried to justify her actions, but it didn't matter. Nothing she could say would undo the damage. Jason had built his world around her, and now it was all crumbling to dust. The pain of what had happened was beginning to turn into something else, an all-consuming numbness. Jason was no longer just angry or sad. He was exhausted by the lies, by the constant battle in his own mind, trying to make sense of the mess she had left behind. But there was no sense to it, no reason for her actions. Jason began to withdraw even further, retreating into himself in ways he hadn't anticipated. His friends reached out, but he kept his distance, not wanting to explain everything to them. How could he explain to them what had happened? How could he tell them that the woman he had loved for so long had shattered him in the worst possible way? He was tired of pretending he was okay when inside he felt hollow. The anger had given way to something darker, regret, shame, and a fear of what came next. He couldn't even look at himself in the mirror anymore. He didn't recognize the man staring back at him. Who was he now, after everything that had happened? What was left of him? One night, after another long day of numbness and isolation, Jason found himself walking through the city. The cold air nipped at his skin, but he didn't feel it. He was too lost in his own thoughts, too consumed by everything that had transpired. He wanted to be anywhere but here, trapped in the thoughts that spiraled deeper and deeper. As he walked, his mind kept returning to Laura. She had promised him everything, her love, her loyalty, but she had taken it all away with her betrayal, and now there was nothing left. He found himself standing outside their house, the house they had built together. The lights inside were dim, but he could see her shadow through the window, moving around in the living room. Jason didn't want to go in, didn't want to face her again, but a part of him was drawn to her. He hadn't spoken to her in days. He didn't even know what he wanted anymore, answers, closure, or simply a chance to scream at her for everything she had done, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The door was closed, the world beyond it a painful reminder of what he had lost. Jason stood there for what felt like hours, unsure of what to do. Should he confront her again? Or should he walk away, leave this place for good and never look back? In the end, it didn't matter. The spiral was already taking hold of him, and no confrontation with Laura could change that. No matter what she said, no matter how much she begged for forgiveness, it wouldn't bring back the trust they had shared. She had destroyed it. He turned and walked away from the house, his feet moving on their own, his heart heavy with the weight of everything. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't bother to check it. He couldn't face another call, another message. He walked for hours, the darkness of the night swallowing him whole, the city's lights flickering around him like distant stars that no longer seemed to matter. Jason didn't know how much time had passed when he finally stopped. His mind was exhausted, his body drained. He didn't know where he was or where he was going. It was only then that he realized he was completely alone. The reality of his situation hit him like a freight train, and Jason collapsed onto a bench, his hands buried in his face. He had no answers, no direction. All he had now was pain that seemed endless, that he couldn't outrun. He was alone in the world, and it terrified him. Jason sat at the desk, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen. He had been pacing for hours, unable to sit still, the anger and pain coursing through him in waves. His mind was a chaotic storm of emotions. But beneath it all, there was a quiet resolve taking shape. He was done being the victim in his own story. No more running away from what had happened. No more hiding from the reality that Laura had destroyed him. This moment right here was where everything changed. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It wasn't about trying to make things right between them. It was about making sure that the hurt she had caused didn't define him. He couldn't erase the betrayal, but he could take control. He leaned forward, clicking through the files on his laptop. The mess he had uncovered, the messages, the financial transactions, the evidence of Laura's deceit, was overwhelming, but it gave him something. It gave him the truth, and the truth was a powerful weapon. Jason hadn't made a decision lightly, but now that he had, there was no turning back. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he crafted an email to Ryan, the same Ryan who had been playing with Laura's heart, using her to fill the void in his own life. Jason wasn't going to let this go. He took a deep breath and typed, "Ryan, I know what's been going on. You've been playing with my wife while I've been left in the dark. I've seen the messages, the lies, the money, but I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at myself. I'm angry for being too blind to see what was right in front of me." Jason paused, his finger hovering over the keys. The raw emotion was almost too much to bear, but he pushed through it, knowing he needed to take control of the situation. "I'm not asking for an apology. I don't need one from you, but I need you to know something. I've been hurt by your actions, but I'm done being the fool. I'm done pretending that this is something I can forget. You made your choice, just like Laura did, and now it's time for both of you to face the consequences." Jason clicked send and leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen as the words lingered in the air. This wasn't the end, far from it, but it was the first step in taking back his life. He wasn't just going to let her walk away unscathed. Laura needed to know what it felt like to lose everything, just like he had. She needed to face the fact that her actions had consequences. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah, a friend who had been trying to reach him for days. She had been the one to encourage him to confront Laura, but Jason had avoided her. He didn't want anyone else involved, didn't want to hear more about forgiveness and second chances. The message was simple. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. You deserve better. Whatever you decide, I'm here for you." Jason closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. He had never been more aware of how alone he felt. But this was his journey, his pain to carry. He didn't want pity. He didn't need comfort. He needed resolution. He needed to feel like he had power over his own life again. He didn't know what would happen next. Maybe Laura would beg for forgiveness again. Maybe she would fight him, try to explain herself one more time. But Jason was done listening to her excuses. He had spent so long trying to understand, trying to find the part of her that still cared. But now, all he saw was a woman who had abandoned him when he needed her most. The plan had been set into motion, and there was no turning back. He would take his power back, piece by piece, and he would stop being the man who had been taken advantage of. He would be the man who chose himself. Jason stared at the screen of his laptop, his mind already working on the next step, the next piece of the puzzle. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not this time. Jason's fingers hovered over his phone, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The message he had sent to Ryan had been deliberate, calculated, and sharp. But now, as the seconds ticked by, the reality of what he had just done started to sink in. His breath was shallow, his chest tight. The anger he had once felt toward Laura was fading, replaced by something darker, an all-consuming sense of powerlessness. He had taken control in a way, but was it enough to fix the mess she had made of his life? The phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Ryan. "You think this will make a difference? You think I'm scared of your threats? Laura and I have been together for months. You're nothing but a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of things." Jason stared at the screen, a cold smile creeping onto his face. He had expected this. Ryan didn't know what was coming, and Jason for the first time in days felt a sense of satisfaction. But that satisfaction quickly turned to anger again. Ryan thought he could just dismiss him, ignore the consequences of what he had done to Jason's life. That's when the plan solidified in his mind. Jason stood up, his mind sharp and focused. He wasn't going to just sit back and let them think they could continue their affair without repercussions. The game had changed. Now, it was about their consequences. He grabbed his coat and left his apartment. His feet carried him on autopilot, each step filled with purpose. The road ahead was unclear, but the need for justice, his own justice, was undeniable. As he approached Lara's house, his chest tightened. The familiar sights, the memories of their life together, hit him like a wave. It was all so different now. This house, which had once been a symbol of love and trust, now felt like a prison. Every corner whispered betrayal, every window echoed the pain she had caused. Jason stood at the door for a moment, gathering himself before knocking. His heart raced, but his mind was calm. He was done with the uncertainty. He was done with being the victim. Lara opened the door, and for a moment she looked like the woman he had married. Her eyes were red, her face swollen from crying, but beneath it there was a resolve that Jason hadn't seen in her before. She was no longer pleading for forgiveness. There was no desperation in her voice when she spoke. Instead, it was a calm, defeated acceptance. "Jason," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You came." "I need to talk to you," Jason said, his voice colder than he intended. "About everything." She stepped aside, allowing him to enter, but there was no warmth in the gesture, no apology. She was waiting, her hands trembling at her sides. Jason looked at her for a long moment, the weight of everything he had uncovered settling like a heavy stone in his stomach. He could still see it, the lies, the secrets, the betrayal, and he could still feel the heartbreak. "I spoke to Ryan," Jason said quietly, his gaze never leaving her face. Lara's eyes flickered, a flash of fear crossing them before she quickly masked it with a faint, empty smile. "What did you say to him?" "I told him the truth," Jason replied, stepping closer to her. "I told him you weren't worth the effort. You weren't worth the pain." Lara's face fell, the color draining from her cheeks. "Jason, please, no," he cut her off, his voice sharp. "I don't want to hear it. All the excuses, all the 'I was confused' nonsense. You made your choice, Lara. You chose him over me, and I'm done being the fool." Her eyes welled with tears, and she took a step toward him. "Please, Jason, He raised a hand to stop her. "It's over. I don't want to talk about this anymore." Lara took a step back, the pain evident in her face, but Jason didn't feel the sympathy he thought he would. Instead, all he felt was the need for closure, the need to make sure she truly understood the weight of what she had done. He stood there, staring at her, knowing that nothing could bring back the life they had. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Lara. What you've done, it's too much." She sank to her knees, her sobs filling the silence of the room. "I'm sorry, Jason. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Jason took a deep breath, steeling himself against the hurt that threatened to break through. He had to be strong now, stronger than ever. "I know," he whispered, "but that doesn't change anything. You don't get to undo what's been done." Lara's crying grew louder, but Jason couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He didn't owe her that anymore. He had been the one who had been wronged. He had been the one who had to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. With one final look, Jason turned and walked toward the door. This was the end. No more apologies. No more chances. He stepped outside, the cold air hitting his face like a wake-up call. As he walked away from the house, he felt the weight lift slightly from his chest. This wasn't over yet, but it was a step toward reclaiming himself. And that, he realized, was the only thing that mattered now. Jason's feet moved on their own, carrying him farther away from the house with each step. He wasn't sure where he was going, but the need to escape, to put distance between himself and the pain, was overpowering. The weight of his decision to leave Lara felt both suffocating and liberating. But even as he walked, he couldn't shake the memory of her broken face, the way she had fallen to her knees, begging for his forgiveness. Her words echoed in his mind, mingling with his own thoughts. "I never meant to hurt you, Jason." He had heard it all before, hadn't he? The same empty apologies, the same justifications. Still, something inside him stirred. The anger, the hurt, it was all still there, simmering beneath the surface. But there was a sliver of doubt now, a nagging voice that asked, what if she really was sorry? He couldn't entertain that thought for long. His heart had been shattered too many times for that. But as he walked through the darkened streets, his steps faltering for just a moment, he knew he had to face her once more. The next morning, Lara showed up at his apartment. He wasn't surprised. He had known she wouldn't give up so easily. But as he opened the door to find her standing there, her face pale and desperate. Something in him hardened. He was done with the back and forth. He had already given her everything he had, and she had torn it apart. He wasn't going to let her manipulate him again. "I don't want to talk to you, Laura," Jason said, his voice firm but cold. "You've said everything you needed to say. It's over." Laura's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. She stepped closer, her voice soft but trembling. "Please, Jason, please don't do this. I know I've hurt you. I know I don't deserve it, but I love you. I need you. You're the only one who ever truly understood me." Jason's jaw clenched. The words felt rehearsed, like something she had practiced in her mind over and over again. He had heard it all before, the same promises, the same desperate attempts to salvage something that had already been broken beyond repair. "You can't keep doing this," he said, his voice shaking with barely contained emotion. "I'm not your safety net, Laura. I'm not the one you run to when things fall apart. I've been nothing but honest with you, and you've treated me like I didn't matter." Laura reached out for him, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "Jason, please. I don't know what happened. It was a mistake, all of it. Ryan, he doesn't matter. You matter. You're everything to me. I was lost." Jason pulled away, his chest tightening as he fought the rising tide of emotion. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But the truth was undeniable. She had made choices, and each one had led them to this moment. "No," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep forgiving you for things you've already broken." Laura's face crumpled, her tears falling freely now. She stepped forward, her voice raw with emotion. "Jason, please, I love you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, just give me a chance, one last chance. I promise I'll never hurt you again." Jason closed his eyes, fighting the flood of emotion that threatened to consume him, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to scream, to tell her how much she had torn him apart, how much he had loved her and how much she had destroyed that love. But all he could manage was a simple, aching whisper. "It's too late." Laura collapsed in front of him, sobbing uncontrollably. "I can't live with myself knowing I've lost you," she cried. "Please, Jason, please don't leave me." Jason stood there, motionless. The anger and sadness that had been swirling inside him for so long were now replaced by a suffocating sense of finality. He had made his decision. There was no turning back. "I'm already gone, Laura," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "You made sure of that." For a moment they both stood in silence, the weight of his words settling between them. Then, without another word, Jason turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the doorway, broken and defeated. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Jason sat in his car outside their old house, the place that had once been filled with laughter and love. Now it felt like a distant memory, as empty as his heart. He hadn't wanted to come back. In fact, he'd been avoiding it for days, but he knew he had to. There was no escaping it anymore. No more hiding from the reality of what his life had become. He checked his phone one last time. There was nothing from Laura, but he knew she would be waiting. He'd told her it was over, and yet, there she was, clinging to the hope that somehow, some way, he might change his mind. He couldn't do it. He couldn't keep dragging this out. He had made his decision, and as much as it hurt, he had to follow through. Jason took a deep breath and got out of the car, the weight of his steps heavy against the pavement. His eyes drifted to the house, the same one where they'd shared so many moments, the kitchen table where they'd sat laughing over dinner, the couch where they'd watched movies together, wrapped up in each other's arms. It all felt like a dream now, a dream that had turned into a nightmare. He had to face it. He had to let go. When he stepped inside, Laura was there standing in the hallway. Her eyes were swollen, red from crying. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she looked so small, so broken. But Jason couldn't feel sorry for her anymore. He had given her everything he had, and she had taken it all for granted. "You came back," Laura whispered, her voice cracking. "I had to," Jason replied softly, his tone steady but empty. "We need to talk." Laura's breath hitched as she stepped closer to him. "I know you're angry with me. I know I've destroyed everything, but please, Jason, please don't leave me. I can't imagine my life without you. I'm so sorry for everything, for all the mistakes. Please, just let me make it right." Jason shook his head, a pang of sadness gripping his chest. But it wasn't just sadness. It was the final realization that he had nothing left to give her. The woman standing before him wasn't the person he had married. She wasn't the person he had trusted with his heart. She was a stranger now, and that hurt more than anything else. "You can't fix this, Lara," Jason said quietly, his voice tinged with finality. "You've broken everything, and I can't keep pretending it's okay. I can't keep going back to the lies." Lara's face crumbled as the tears spilled over once again. "I never wanted to hurt you, Jason. I never wanted to lose you. I was selfish, and I made the biggest mistake of my life. Please give me one more chance. I swear I'll change. I'll do anything." Jason looked at her, his heart heavy with emotion. For so long he had wanted to believe that things could be different, that maybe they could find a way back to the love they once had. But now, looking at her, he knew it was impossible. The trust was gone. The love was gone. She had taken it all away. "I can't, Lara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've already lost you, and I need to lose you to find myself again." Her sobs grew louder, but Jason didn't move. He couldn't comfort her. He had to be strong for himself now. He had to walk away, even though it felt like his heart was being torn from his chest. "You have to let me go," Jason said softly, his voice shaking with the weight of the words. "We both need to move on. This isn't love anymore." Lara collapsed to her knees, her hands pressing against the floor as if she could somehow reach out to him to keep him from leaving. "Please, Jason, I'm begging you, don't leave me like this." Jason turned away, his body heavy with the burden of what he was doing. He had to leave. He had to, because staying would only tear him apart even more. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking for the first time. "But I can't keep doing this. Goodbye, Lara." And with that, Jason walked out the door, the finality of the decision settling into his bones. As he stepped into the night, the weight of the past year pressed down on him, but he couldn't look back. He didn't know what the future held for him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was taking control of his own life again. It wouldn't be easy, and the pain wouldn't go away overnight, but he would heal. He had to. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. The last goodbye had been said, and now he was free. Jason stood by the window, staring out at the world that seemed so unchanged, and yet for him had shifted irreparably. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the city, but all he saw was the emptiness in his chest, the silence that now filled his life. He hadn't heard from Lara in days, no calls, no messages. And strangely, a part of him felt the weight of her absence in ways he hadn't expected. But another part of him, the part that had been devastated by her betrayal, felt relief. The silence, while painful, was his own. He could breathe again. He had made the right decision. He kept telling himself that, but it didn't make the pain go away. The aftermath of everything, Lara's affair, the lies, the cold, heart-wrenching confrontation, still lingered in his mind, haunting him in quiet moments like this one. He couldn't escape the feeling of being blindsided, of having given so much of himself to someone who had never truly valued it. Jason picked up his phone, scrolling through the messages on his screen. There were a few from his friends, checking in on him, asking how he was doing. He had been distant, had barely responded. He didn't want to talk to anyone, not about Lara, not about what had happened. He wasn't ready to share his pain with the world. He wasn't ready to explain the shattered pieces of himself to anyone who had never lived through the hell he had. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, trying to block out the intrusive thoughts that still crept into his mind. Would things ever get better? Would he ever trust again? Would he ever be able to love without fear? For the first time in his life, Jason felt completely alone. The world seemed like a vast, empty place, and he was a mere spectator, watching it go by without any real connection to it. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay stuck. He couldn't allow himself to be consumed by the pain of the past. With a deep breath, Jason stood and walked to the door. He wasn't going to let this define him, not anymore. There was a world beyond the hurt, beyond the wreckage of his marriage. He had to find it again. The first few days after the separation had been the hardest. The first time he had come back to an empty apartment was almost too much to bear. The loneliness had hit him like a physical force. Every corner of the apartment, every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf seemed like a reminder of what had been, of what had been stolen from him. But with each passing day, the pain dulled a little more. He began to find small bits of peace in the quiet moments. He rediscovered old hobbies he had neglected, painting, reading, going for long walks. He started to rebuild his routine, one piece at a time. One evening, as he sat alone at his kitchen table, he finally picked up his phone and called Sarah. He hadn't spoken to her in a while, not wanting to burden her with the weight of his emotions, but he knew it was time. "Hey, Sarah," he said when she answered, his voice steadier than it had been in days. "It's Jason." "Oh my God, Jason." Sarah's voice was warm, comforting. "I've been so worried about you. How are you holding up?" Jason smiled weakly, though it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm getting there. Slowly." "Do you want to talk about it?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. He paused, thinking for a moment. He wasn't sure if he was ready to share everything, but he knew Sarah would understand. "I think I'm starting to accept it," Jason said quietly. "What happened with Laura? It wasn't easy, but I think I'm finally beginning to let it go. I'm focusing on moving forward." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice was soft, filled with compassion. "You're stronger than you know, Jason. But don't do it alone. Let people in when you're ready. You deserve better than what happened with her." Jason nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He had always been the type to keep his feelings locked away, to deal with his pain in silence. But Sarah was right. He wasn't meant to carry it alone. "Thanks, Sarah," Jason said, his voice breaking slightly. "You've been there for me when no one else was. I don't know what I would have done without you." Sarah's reply was soft and caring. "You don't have to thank me. I'm here always." As he hung up the phone, Jason felt something shift inside him. It was a small shift, but it was enough. He wasn't alone. He didn't have to carry the burden of betrayal and heartbreak alone. The people who cared about him were still here, and slowly, piece by piece, he would rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy. The road to healing never was. But Jason was ready to move on, ready to grow, ready to reclaim the life he had almost lost. The aftermath had been brutal, but it had also given him something valuable, the chance to rediscover who he truly was, and that, he realized, was worth fighting for.